During the company dinner, I revealed that the boss was my wife's lover and announced the divorce in front of everyone present. The silence that followed was deafening. The glazed-over looks, the uncomfortable smiles that crumbled in shock, the cutlery that stopped moving on plates that were still full. The environment once filled with lively conversations and celebratory toasts was now a frozen scene of disbelief. I had dropped the bomb. I had broken the mask right there, in front of everyone. Her eyes widened, her mouth half open, unable to find words. He, sitting next to you, remained motionless for a few seconds before swallowing hard, sweat forming on his forehead, his hands shaking slightly. Those two thought they could make a fool of me forever. That they could laugh behind my back, hide the complicit glances, the disguised touches, the urgent escapes in the middle of the workday. They thought I would never find out. But I found out. Betrayal smells. It tastes good. There is an invisible weight that lodges in the chest and grows over time. First, there are the small excuses, the subtle changes in routine. Then comes the distancing, the evasive answers, the empty looks. It's the way her skin no longer reacts to my touch. How forced your laugh sounds when we're alone. How her cell phone never faces up again. And then, one day, a detail slips through the cracks. A message read too quickly, a perfume that isn't mine, an absence that lasts longer than it should. Instinct screams. The truth creeps into the corners of the house like a ghost ready to reveal itself. For months, I tortured myself in silence, pretending not to see. Trying to believe that it was all in my head, that my mind was playing tricks. But the truth has a cruel way of finding loopholes. And she found it. I saw. I heard. I knew. Every detail. Every lie. Every time she said she loved me and then ran into his arms. The boss. My boss. And now, there, at that dinner, in front of coworkers, friends and acquaintances, their mask had fallen. The power was in my hands. And I wasn't going to waste it. You have nothing to say? My voice cut through the silence, echoing throughout the room. She blinked several times, her mouth trembling. He looked around, as if seeking refuge in the eyes of others, but found only shock and judgment. It's not like that, he tried to stammer. Isn't that so? He laughs, but without humor. Then explain to me. Explains how your midday escapades coincide with his absences. Explains hotel reservations. It explains why a married man, the head of the company, has been quietly fucking the wife of one of the employees for months. Explain. The air became heavy. The boss lowered his head, running a hand over his face as he muttered a curse to himself. Some employees exchanged embarrassed glances, others shrank into their chairs, as if they wanted to blend into the furniture. She stood up suddenly, her eyes wet, her breathing quick. We can talk about this in private. I let out a short, bitter laugh. In private? Ah, now you want privacy. After months of cheating on me like I was an idiot. After turning my marriage into a joke. No, dear. Now everyone here will listen. Because all this time I was the only one who didn't know. She opened her mouth to retort, but I continued. And since we're here, let's make things official. I'm asking for a divorce. You can stay with him if he still wants you after this. The boss looked at her, as if he were seeing the woman he had become involved with for the first time. What did he think? That it would just be a passing diversion? That there would be no consequences? Now, in front of everyone, he saw exactly what he had gotten himself into. He saw that the woman with whom he spent so many nights in hiding was the same one who was now, desperate, trying to find a way to get out of this without looking like the villain. But it was too late. Someone cleared their throat. Another employee shifted in his chair. Murmurs began to spread throughout the hall. Nobody knew how to react. It was a corporate dinner that became the stage for a revelation that no one expected. "You can't do this," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I approached, lowering my voice a little, but without losing my firm tone. "I already did." I took one last look around. I found faces that expressed a mixture of surprise, pity and even satisfaction. Who else knew? Who else was suspicious and never said anything? How long was I the company's joke without even suspecting it? Betrayal doesn't just happen between two people. It spreads. She has silent accomplices. I took a deep breath. The anger no longer burned like it used to. It was a controlled ember, burning firmly inside me. I picked up my wine glass, raised it in the air and toasted. At the end of a lie. I drank the last drink and left, leaving behind the chaos that had started. But that wasn't the end. Not yet. Because betrayals always leave traces, and the consequences of this story were just beginning. What no one knew, and what I was about to discover, was that this dinner would be the turning point of their lives. Because while I was exposing everything and thinking that their downfall would only be moral, the universe was preparing something much bigger. Something that would make this scandal seem like just the beginning of a storm. And, in the end, the question that would echo would not be about who betrayed who. But yes, who really lost. Welcome to the channel. Here, the betrayal never is romanticized. All stories are fictional, but they reflect the harsh reality. Cheating destroys lives, corrodes relationships and leaves irreversible scars. Our goal is to show the consequences raw and impactful of infidelity, bluntly. Get ready, because what you're about to hear it will mess with your emotions. Take a deep breath. The story is beginning. The restaurant hall was elegantly decorated for the occasion. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting golden light over tables covered in impeccably white tablecloths. The ambient sound was a gentle mix of discreet conversations and the clink of glasses being raised for toasts. It was an important night for the company. A celebratory dinner, a long-awaited event where employees could finally relax, exchanging corporate formalities for smiles and mutual compliments. Among the guests, a couple caught attention due to their apparent harmony. Ethan and Claire had been together for almost a decade. They had built a stable life, based on complicity and what, for many, seemed like unshakable love. He, a meticulous and dedicated man, always sought to ensure the best for both of them. His career required effort, but he was proud of each achievement, because each one was also for her. Claire, in turn, was charming and had a striking presence. He had a natural charisma that captivated those around him. At the beginning of their relationship, they were inseparable, in love, living each moment as if they were unique. Over time, the routine enveloped them like a warm blanket, taking away some of the excitement but strengthening the stability they valued so much. Ethan was methodical, someone who valued planning and predictability. His days started early, always punctual, following an almost sacred ritual. Strong coffee, quick reading of the news, and then off to work. He was always a man of strict values. He believed in loyalty, effort and transparency. He was someone who kept his promises, who was always there when they needed him most. And Claire knew it. I knew I could count on him for anything. She, on the other hand, was driven by the desire for novelty. I liked the feeling of freedom, the unexpected, the magnetism of new experiences. She was sociable, spontaneous, full of energy. But he also had his doubts. There were moments when she felt restless, as if something was missing. Small discomforts, sensations that I couldn't name. And perhaps that's why she became increasingly involved in company events, where she could be the center of attention, where she could feel alive, wanted. That night, sitting side by side at the company dinner, they looked like an ordinary, well-adjusted couple. Ethan kept a calm smile on his face, although his eyes were attentive to every detail around him. I observed interactions, greeted colleagues, participated in conversations about goals and strategies, but without losing sight of Claire. She, on the other hand, was more relaxed, laughing easily, seeming completely at ease in that environment. The company's CEO, Nathan, was a respected and admired figure. A charming man, with an engaging speech, who always seemed to know exactly what to say. Everyone saw him as a natural leader, someone who inspired, who made people want to do their best. He moved around the room naturally, talking to different groups, praising performances, making everyone feel valued. Claire, who was always enchanted by charismatic people, liked the way he ran the company. Ethan respected him too, but in a different way. He saw Nathan as a strategic man, someone who knew how to play his cards right to stay on top. The night remained peaceful. Wine glasses were filled repeatedly, laughter echoed in the corners of the restaurant, and the atmosphere was relaxed. Ethan and Claire were very close, talking to some colleagues. At a certain point, Nathan joined the group. His comments were always insightful, and his presence dominated any conversation. The looks between Claire and Nathan were subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. But Ethan understood everything. He noticed the way her eyes sparkled a little more when he spoke. The way she tilted her head, interested, every time he told a story. He noticed, but didn't say anything. I didn't want to seem paranoid or suspicious for no reason. The dinner unfolded like any other corporate event. The celebratory atmosphere increased as the hours passed. Some people were already a little altered by alcohol, conversations became more relaxed, and interactions more spontaneous. Ethan remained alert. Something in his chest tightened, a subtle uneasiness that he tried to ignore. He was not an insecure man. It never was. But that night, I felt a discomfort that I couldn't explain. A feeling perhaps. Claire seemed more excited than usual. His laugh was looser, his gaze more alive. She always liked these events, the social contact, the lightness that came with these nights. Ethan, as much as he was used to it, felt like there was something different. A small detail, but enough to plant a doubt in your mind. Nathan was in his role as host, moving from one group to another, but he always seemed to find a way to get back to Claire. A joke here, a comment there. Small gestures that could be interpreted in many ways. Ethan watched, but tried not to jump to conclusions. After all, nothing was wrong. Right? As the night progressed, Ethan allowed himself to relax a little. He drank another glass of wine, laughed at some jokes, and tried to shake off the thoughts that were beginning to form in his mind. Beside him, Claire was smiling, her face illuminated by the soft light of the restaurant. She looked happy. He wanted to believe everything was okay. That night was just one of many. But deep down, something told him no. The atmosphere of the corporate dinner was still in the air when Ethan and Claire returned home that night. The silence in the car was almost palpable, filled with unspoken thoughts and unexplained sensations. Ethan kept his eyes fixed on the road, trying to ignore the uneasiness that was growing inside him. He wanted to believe that he was just tired, that his mind was playing tricks, but the image of the looks exchanged between Claire and Nathan persisted like an insistent shadow. Claire, beside him, was playing with her cell phone with the screen slightly tilted away from him. His fingers swiped quickly, deleting messages almost as soon as he read them. Ethan noticed but didn't say anything. He swallowed hard and looked away. Since when did he start noticing these little details? Since when did you start to feel like her presence by your side was just an illusion of closeness? When they got home, Claire went straight to the shower. Ethan stayed in the room for a few moments, feeling the weight of that night settle on his shoulders. There was something there, something he couldn't name, but it squeezed his chest like a silent warning. When he went to the bedroom, Claire was already lying down, her hair was still damp, her face was facing the other side of the bed. He lay down next to her but didn't touch her. The space between them has never felt so wide. Over the next few days, Ethan tried to shake off the restlessness, to convince himself that everything was normal. But Claire seemed more distracted. His cell phone was never far away, his absences during the day were more frequent, and there was a different shine in his eyes. It wasn't the glow it was when she looked at him. It was a glow of something new, of something secret. Morning kisses were hurried, hugs fleeting. Claire always seemed too busy, always in a hurry to be somewhere else. Ethan watched everything without saying anything, hoping that, at some point, that feeling would pass. But, on the contrary, it only increased. One night, Ethan woke up in the middle of the night and realized that Claire wasn't in bed. His heart raced as he stood up and walked to the living room. There she was, sitting on the couch, whispering into the phone. He stood in the darkness, hearing only fragments of the conversation. Her voice was sweet, engaging. The tone he used was not that of a simple conversation with a friend. It was something intimate. Something that made his blood run cold. She hung up quickly when she noticed his presence. He smiled in a practiced way, saying he couldn't sleep and decided to check some messages from work. Ethan didn't argue. He just watched her for a long moment before going back to bed. From that night on, he knew he needed to confirm his suspicions. The next day, Ethan left for work as usual, but he didn't go straight to the office. He stopped at the cafe on the corner and watched his own house from a distance. Claire came out minutes later, well-groomed, with a gleam of expectation in her eyes that I hadn't seen in a while. She got in the car and drove to a hotel in the city center. Ethan followed her, keeping enough distance so she wouldn't notice. He parked across the street, watching as Claire got out of the car and entered the building. He stood there, motionless, waiting. 15 minutes later, he saw Nathan enter the same door. The confirmation came like a punch in the stomach. A lump rose in his throat, and a heat of anger and humiliation spread through his body. He wanted to be wrong. I wish your mind had created all that. But there was the truth, raw and unforgiving. Ethan didn't know how long he stayed there, standing in the car, trying to process what he had just seen. The world around him seemed to spin slowly, as if time had slowed down to force him to absorb every detail. The image of Claire and Nathan entering the hotel together replayed in his mind like a broken movie, always returning to the same point. When he finally managed to move, his hands were shaking on the steering wheel. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to think clearly. He could confront them right then and there, explode right then, and end it all. But something inside him said to wait. To keep that. To use that pain in a more calculated way. He returned home before her. He sat on the sofa, his mind racing. When Claire arrived, later than usual, she smiled at him as if nothing had happened. And he smiled back. Because now he knew. And I was ready to play this game until the end. The corporate dinner had been the perfect setting for Ethan to execute his plan. He knew how to wait. I knew how to observe. He had gathered evidence, every detail meticulously recorded, but decided the right time to expose everything needed to be public. It needed to have an impact. He needed to make every second of humiliation he felt return double. And now, here, in front of all his coworkers, in front of Nathan himself, in front of her, Claire, he no longer had any doubts. The clinking of silverware stopped as Ethan lifted his wine glass. Eyes turned to him, some expecting a toast, others already suspicious of his rigid posture. He looked around, feeling the weight of the moment, and then he smiled, a cold, calculated smile. Tonight is one of celebration, but also of revelations. His voice sounded firm, dominating the room. And I think everyone here deserves to know the truth about some internal dynamics of the company. The air became heavy, filled with an almost palpable tension. Claire's eyes widened, her hands instinctively clutching the napkin in her lap. Nathan, at his side, fidgeted with his shirt collar, as if he had suddenly become insufficient for air. You know, Nathan, Ethan continued, lightly turning the glass between his fingers, I've always admired the way you run this company. Your posture, your confidence. I have always seen you as an example of leadership. But now I realized that his leadership extends beyond the office, and deep into the hotel room. Murmurs began to permeate the hall. Some choked on their food, others leaned forward in their chairs to hear better. Claire's face turned to pure terror. "Ethan, please," her voice was low, almost a whisper. He laughed, but not in a relaxed way. It was a bitter laugh, full of contempt. "Please. Now you want discretion. Now you want to resolve this privately. After months of cheating on me, after throwing away years of marriage like they were nothing." Claire tried to take his hand, but he pulled away. Nathan, who always had impeccable poise, was now tense. His eyes scanned the room in search of a way out, but there was no escape. "I know everything," Ethan continued, more quietly, but with an intensity that made everyone hold their breath. "Every excuse, every meeting, every deleted message. I know about the hotels, the hidden dinners, the hidden touches during work hours. And the funniest thing? I thought I was becoming paranoid. But no. I was right all along." Claire brought her hand to her mouth, tears gathering in her eyes. Nathan clenched his fists on the table, his face becoming a mask of tension. "But it doesn't stop there," Ethan added, leaning forward slightly. "Because what you don't know is that this betrayal had consequences." The entire hall held its breath. Claire shook her head, silently begging him to stop. But Ethan wouldn't stop. Not now. He pulled an envelope from his pocket and threw it on the table. Claire recognized him immediately and felt her world fall apart. "Go ahead, open it. Let everyone see." Her hands shook as she took the envelope. She hesitated for a moment before finally opening it, and then her eyes widened as she read the contents. It can't be." Nathan pulled the paper from his hands and his expression hardened. He swallowed hard, but was unable to deny what was before him. "Ah, so now you seem surprised, Claire. You should have thought of this before." The silence in the room was absolute. Every person in that room felt like they were witnessing something bigger than a simple scandal. Ethan crossed his arms, his voice now thick with irony. "The entire company will want to know how you, Nathan, ended up signing documents committing funds to a fictitious investment. How can an experienced CEO be so careless? Maybe because he was too busy with other matters." The truth fell like a bomb. Nathan, who until then had been trying to maintain his posture, finally realized the size of the problem. It wasn't just an exposed case. It was something that could destroy him professionally. Claire's eyes widened, her mind desperately trying to connect the dots. "Did you set him up?" Ethan leaned in close to her, his face inches from hers, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I just exposed what was already happening. I just waited for the right moment to deliver the final blow." Nathan's face turned to pure panic. He pulled his cell phone out of his pocket, started typing frantically, but soon realized it was too late. Ethan had already taken all precautions. Claire, now panting, turned to Ethan, her face crumpled in despair. "You destroyed him." He stared at her for a long moment before responding. "No, Claire. You did it. You just didn't realize it before." The room, once vibrant with laughter and toasts, was now plunged into absolute silence. And in that moment, everyone knew that Nathan and Claire's lives would never be the same again. The silence that followed the impact of the revelation seemed to suffocate the environment. Claire clutched the envelope between her trembling fingers, the paper crumpling under the pressure of her uneven breathing. Nathan, still holding the documents that sealed his ruin, stared into space, as if his mind was desperately trying to find a way out of something that no longer had a solution. The employees' gazes pierced them like invisible blades, filled with judgment and disbelief. The prestige, the authority, the respect, all falling apart before the watchful eyes of those who, until a few minutes ago, saw him as an unshakable leader. Nathan stood up abruptly, the chair scraping on the floor with a sharp noise. Sweat dripped down his forehead, his jaw clenched as he tried to compose himself. "This is absurd." His voice was louder than he intended, echoing in the room. Ethan crossed his arms, watching with a slight sneer. "Absurd? What exactly is nonsense? The fact that you thought you could walk all over me without consequences? Or the fact that your facade empire has just collapsed in front of everyone?" Claire looked at Nathan, searching for some explanation, anything that could erase what was happening. But he didn't say anything. His expression was that of a trapped man, unable to escape his own mistake. She turned to Ethan, her face brimming with despair. "What did you do?" His voice was a whisper, full of anguish. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his eyes boring into hers with a calculated coldness. "I just returned it in kind. But I knew how to wait for the right moment." She shook her head, tears gathering in her eyes. "You destroyed him. You destroyed everything." He laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Ah, Claire, do you think it was you who destroyed everything? You were very comfortable in the shadows, playing with fire, thinking you would never get burned. Now that the flames have reached you, do you want to blame me?" Nathan threw the papers on the table violently, breathing heavily. His gaze met Claire's, and for a moment, something passed between them, a silent understanding, a recognition of the end. "Did you know that?" His voice was cold, accusatory. She blinked, confused. "Then?" He pointed at the papers, his lips quivering with pent-up anger. "This here. Did you know he was up to something?" She looked back at Ethan, a new wave of panic rising within her. I don't." Ethan shrugged. "Ah, Claire. If only you had paid a little more attention to me in the last few months, maybe you would have realized that I also knew how to play this game." Her expression transformed. The betrayal against Ethan was already a pain she was still trying to process, but now it was as if the ground was opening up beneath her feet. She felt nauseous. Nathan took a step back, rubbing his face, his mind spinning in despair. "You don't understand what you did. It doesn't end here." Ethan raised his eyebrows, slight amusement tinging his voice. "No." "Ah, then enlighten me, Nathan. What exactly can you do now? Are you thinking about saving your reputation? In fixing your company? Because I have news for you." He pointed to the employees sitting around, all still in shock. "They you already know. And tomorrow, when this story gets out, the rest of the world will know too." Nathan swallowed. He was always a man of power, always in control, always above others. But now, that control was slipping through his fingers. He turned abruptly and left the restaurant, leaving a trail of murmurs and tense looks. Claire stayed behind, her eyes fixed on Ethan, as if she was still trying to understand how everything got there. "Do you want to destroy me?" His voice was a hoarse whisper, full of pain. Ethan finally gave her a longer look. For an instant, something flashed across his eyes, something that looked like nostalgia, or perhaps regret. "I just wanted you to feel what I felt." She opened her mouth, but there was nothing more to say. Because the truth was there, among them, irreversible. The hall slowly began to move again. The employees whispered among themselves, some got up discreetly, as if the simple act of remaining there would become compromising. Dinner was over. The spectacle had come to an end. Ethan took a deep breath and turned to leave. Claire wanted to call him. "I wanted to say something, anything. But I knew there were no words that could change what was already done." And so, as he walked out the door, she realized she was alone. Completely alone. The rain began to fall lightly when Ethan left the restaurant. The cold night air felt less suffocating than the environment he had left behind. The voices still echoed in his mind, the gazes fixed on him as he revealed everything, the frozen expressions of surprise, shock, and judgment. But, above all, what stayed most in his mind was Claire's look that wavered between disbelief and fear. Afraid of the ruin that now surrounded her. He crossed the street leisurely, feeling the humidity touch his face. Every step he took seemed to ease the weight he had been carrying for months, a weight he didn't even know was so crushing until he finally left it behind. He felt no regret. I felt no remorse. Just a strange feeling of release. In the restaurant, Claire was still sitting, her hands on the table, the envelope paper partially crumpled between her fingers. She felt the pressure of the looks around her, the whispers, the looks of pity and contempt. His mind spun. Everything happened too quickly. A minute ago, she was laughing, toasting like nothing was wrong. The next minute, his life was falling apart in front of everyone. She raised her head, looking for Nathan, but he was no longer there. It was gone, probably trying to contain the damage, putting out fires that could no longer be controlled. His mouth was dry, his heart was beating fast. He tried to pick up his cell phone, but his hands were shaking too much. I needed to get out of there. Getting up and leaving seemed like an impossible challenge. But finally he did. He passed by the employees who were still sitting, avoiding looks that he didn't want to meet. He walked through the restaurant doors and felt the cold air hit his skin. Ethan's car was no longer there. She knew he wouldn't come home. When he finally got into his own car, he leaned his forehead against the steering wheel and let out a shaky breath. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. The phone vibrated next to him. When he picked it up to see it, a message from Nathan appeared on the screen. We need to talk. Now. She hesitated for a moment, then started the engine and got out of there. The city seemed bigger than before, colder, more hostile. The streets blurred past her as she drove to the address Nathan had sent her. The path seemed endless, and at each red light, she felt the weight of what she had done sinking deeper into her chest. When he arrived, he was already waiting outside, standing next to the building where his penthouse was located. He didn't look like the same man she knew. The confident gleam in his eyes was gone. He was exhausted, dejected, his jaw clenched in tension. She got out of the car and walked towards him, hesitantly. What are we going to do? His voice was low, almost a whisper. Nathan ran a hand through his hair, letting out a heavy sigh. Do you really want to know? She swallowed hard. He no longer seemed like a powerful man, in charge of the situation. He looked like a man about to lose everything. He finished us off, he said, finally looking at her. It ended everything. She didn't respond. I didn't know what to say. If the board finds out what was exposed today, he passed his hand over his face, frustrated. I'm finished. You too. She crossed her arms, hugging herself. I didn't want it to end like this. He let out a humorless laugh. No. So how did you think it would end? Do you think we could continue this forever? Without anyone finding out? She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. Nathan watched her, his gaze assessing every detail of her expression. Do you regret it? She blinked, surprised by the question. EU. The words caught in his throat. She didn't know the answer. Or maybe he knew, but didn't want to admit it. He approached, his voice now lower, carrying something she couldn't identify. You know he will never forgive you, right? Her chest tightened. I know. So what are you going to do now? She didn't respond. Because, for the first time, she had no answer. Nathan let out another sigh and looked at the street. I need to disappear for a while. Her eyes widened. What? I have no choice, Claire. If I stay here, I will be destroyed. My name, my career, my entire life. She felt a chill run down her spine. Are you saying you're going to leave me alone? He stared at her for a long moment. You made your choice. I did mine. Now, everyone for themselves. She opened her mouth to protest, but he was already walking into the building, without looking back. And at that moment, she realized she had nothing left. Nowhere to go. No person to turn to. Ethan had achieved. He took everything from her. And for the first time, she felt the true weight of betrayal. The cold wind bit into Claire's skin as she stood on the sidewalk, watching the door Nathan had disappeared through. His footsteps still echoed in her mind, a sound that seemed to mark the end of everything she knew. She wanted to follow him, wanted to demand answers, wanted to beg for something, but she knew there was nothing more to be said. Nathan was on the run, and she was left to deal with the wreckage alone. Her body was rigid, as if her mind had not yet accepted the reality that was unfolding before her. The phone vibrated in his hand, notifications arriving one after the other. Messages from friends, acquaintances, even the company. The scandal was already spreading. She felt a wave of nausea rise through her stomach, a suffocating pressure in her chest. Each notification was another blow, another reminder that her life was falling apart, brick by brick. He got into the car aimlessly, his hands shaking as he turned the key in the ignition. His mind was in chaos. I couldn't go back home. Ethan wouldn't be there. And even if she was, she knew there would be nothing waiting for her other than the absolute emptiness her betrayal had created. He drove through the streets without paying attention to where he was going, the city lights passing through his eyes like unreal figures. She wondered when it had all gone so wrong. When did the choices that seemed so harmless begin to form the current that now dragged her to the bottom? The car stopped in front of a building he knew well. He stood there, looking at the bright hall, his heart hammering in his chest. He took a deep breath and left. The doorman recognized her and let her in without question. He took the elevator up, feeling the tension tighten his muscles. When the door opened, he walked slowly down the hallway and stopped in front of an apartment door. She hesitated before knocking. The door opened a few seconds later. Ethan stood there, staring at her, his face impassive. He didn't seem surprised to see her. "What are you doing here?" She swallowed hard. I didn't know where to go." He laughed, but without any trace of humor. "And you thought I was your best option?" She felt the tears building up, but she forced herself to remain firm. I need to talk to you." He crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Say what, Claire? That you're sorry? That everything was a mistake? That if you could go back, would you do it differently?" She lowered her head. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything." She looked up at him, searching for some remnant of the man who once loved her. But all he found was coldness. "I just wanted to understand," his voice was shaky. "How were you able to plan all of this? Of waiting so long to destroy me?" He stared at her for a long moment before responding. "Because I needed to feel like I was worth it." She felt a shiver run down her spine. Was it worth it? Ethan let out a sigh and finally stepped back, leaving room for her to enter. The apartment was small but cozy. He didn't look like a man who had just destroyed his life. He looked peaceful, serene, as if he had finally found peace. She sat on the sofa, hugging herself. "I don't know who you are anymore." Ethan watched her for a moment before sitting down across from her. "I am the man you betrayed. The man who trusted you. The man who loved you enough to never suspect." She closed her eyes for a second, feeling the weight of those words. "I never wanted it to end like this." He tilted his head, assessing her. "But it's over." Silence settled between them, dense, filled with everything that would never be said again. "Nathan left you, didn't he?" he asked after a while. She nodded, her throat feeling tight. Ethan let out a low laugh. "Of course." She took a deep breath. "I don't know where to go." He watched her for a long moment before responding. "You always had options, Claire. You just chose the wrong ones." She felt the cry catch in her throat. I just wanted you to understand me. He shook his head. I understand. But that doesn't change anything. She wanted to insist, she wanted to find some silver lining, some chance for redemption. But all he found was a chasm between them. And then, finally, she understood. There was no turning back. Ethan was no longer her refuge. He was the storm that swallowed her whole. And now, there was nothing left but emptiness. Ethan remained silent as Claire sat across from him, her eyes lost, her hands clasped in her lap as if she were trying to keep herself together. He watched every detail, the trembling of her lips, her unstable breathing, her fingers pressing against each other. She looked smaller than before. Fragile, disarmed. The confident glow he always carried with him was gone, leaving only a cold, purposeless emptiness. She expected something from him. A response, a gesture, anything that could break that oppressive silence. But Ethan didn't intend to offer anything. There was nothing more to say. What do I do now? Her voice was low, almost a whisper. Ethan didn't look away, but his expression was unwavering. You live with the consequences. Claire blinked, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. I don't know how. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, and looked into her eyes with a coldness that made her shiver. It's not my problem. She stood there, motionless, as if her mind was trying to assimilate those words. Ethan got up, walked to the door and opened it without haste, without hesitation. The meaning of that gesture was clear. Claire didn't move a muscle. She began, but the words died before they were even formed. Ethan raised an eyebrow, waiting. Just tell me that one day I'll be able to fix this. He let out a dry, humorless laugh. There's nothing left to fix. She stood up slowly, her shoulders hunched by the weight of what she was carrying. She walked to the door, but stopped next to him, looking at his face one last time. Did you really love me? The answer came without hesitation. Yes. But that doesn't matter anymore. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if she wanted to freeze that moment, keep that answer inside her, hold it as the last memory of something that no longer existed. Then, without saying anything else, he crossed the door and disappeared. Ethan stood there, listening to her footsteps moving away down the hall, the sound of the elevator closing, and then absolute silence. He closed the door slowly and took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, he felt like the weight of betrayal was no longer on his shoulders. Claire was no longer part of him. The phone rang. He picked up the device and saw the name of a colleague at work, someone he had been talking to for the last few months, someone who appeared in his life like a beacon in the darkness. He answered with a discreet smile on his face. Hi. Yes, I'm fine. Dinner? Sounds like a great idea. Ethan grabbed his coat and left the apartment, closing the door behind him without looking back. Meanwhile, Claire wandered aimlessly through the streets. The cold bit her skin, but she didn't feel it. The phone vibrated non-stop, messages from friends, co-workers, people who now seemed distant, untouchable. Nathan is gone. No news, no calls. He ran away, leaving her behind, to face what he didn't have the courage to face. She thought about going home, but she knew she would find nothing but silence there. Ethan wouldn't come back. That place was no longer home. She had lost everything, and now she felt the true weight of her choice. The betrayal had been costly. Nathan was unable to escape the consequences. The scandal took on greater proportions than he anticipated. The board of directors cut ties with him immediately, exposing all the wrongdoing that came to light after Ethan's revelation. His reputation was destroyed, his assets were frozen, his closest contacts drifted away one by one. His phone no longer rang with invitations to exclusive events or important meetings. He was no longer the influential man he once was. Claire learned, days later, that he was trying to start over somewhere else, far away, as if he could escape his own shadow. But she knew the truth. Nathan would never be the same again. And neither does she. Time passed. The headlines changed, new stories emerged, and the scandal was slowly replaced by other business dramas. But for Claire, the impact never wore off. The void remained. She tried to get back on her feet, tried to rebuild her life. But some falls are irreversible. Ethan, on the other hand, found something he thought he lost forever. In the midst of the destruction, he realized that there was still something waiting for him beyond pain. A new opportunity, a genuine fresh start. He looked to the future with confidence, leaving the past where it belonged. Betrayal always takes its toll. Now tell me, what did you think of this story? Leave your comment with your opinion. I want to know what you think about this twist. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories like this. And remember, we do not support any kind of betrayal here. The truth always comes out, and the price to be paid is never small. Until next time.